Lovely, everyone. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for tonight's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. Before we begin, I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. My colleague Ashley will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes that you'll purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy the conversation. Tonight, I have the great honor of introducing Mariam Rahmani and Kaveh Akbar to discuss and celebrate the publication of Mariam's English translation of Mahsa Mohebali's groundbreaking novel, In Case of Emergency. Mariam Rahmani is a writer and translator. Her fiction has appeared in Gulf Coast, her translations in N+1, Columbia Journal, and After Cinema, Fictions from a Collective Memory, and her nonfiction in Granta, Bomb Magazine, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Rumpus. She holds a PhD in comparative literature and is the recipient of a PEN/Heim Translation Fund grant, as well as a Fulbright Research Award. She is currently working on her debut novel. And tonight's moderator, Kaveh Akbar, is the author of 2 books of poetry, Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, and the editor of the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse. His poems have appeared in the New Yorker, Paris Review, the New York Times, Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. Born in Tehran, Kaveh teaches at Purdue University and in the Low Residency MFA programs at Randolph and Warren Wilson College. He serves as poetry editor for The Nation. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now Mariam and Kaveh.
Oh, man. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Cool. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Pierce. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Brookline. It's an honor to get to talk about this book, which I'm so excited on its pub date, no less. It makes me feel like like I get to be a tiny little part of this, celebrating this book's advent into the world. Is a profound honor. I'm so enamored of it, and I'm so eager to talk about everything, and the time that we have together is not enough, so I want to get moving quickly. And I think that the first thing that we're going to do is you're maybe going to be so kind as to read to us a little bit from it.
Yes.
Cool. So I will shut up so that the people who've come here, thank you all to the people who've come here, especially I think that someone said that they were here from the UK, where I think it's like 2 in the morning or something like that. So shout out to you especially. I'll sort of cede the floor to my betters so that the people can sort of hear what they've came here to hear.
Thank you so much, Kaveh. And thanks also, of course, to Brookline for hosting us. So I'm just going to read actually from the beginning of the book to start. Click, click, she's right by my ear. I can't move. If she sees I'm awake, she won't leave. She whispers and clicks, clicks, clicks till she hits 1,000 or 2 and the digital prayer beads go off. The beeping announces that she's prayed enough to absolve us all of our sins, or not. She probably hasn't put the thing down since midnight when the tremors started. She opened the door and screamed every half hour, screaming bloody murder 10 times for each tremor. How many screams does that make? They were all yelling and screaming till the sun came up. Abba's voice was the only one missing. I bet he didn't even move a muscle, like during the night bombings back in the day. I haven't moved either. I mean, I was high all night, and I floated even higher every time the bed caught a wave. Like a boat, or maybe a cradle, or no, like a coffin. That's what it is now, a coffin stuffed with wet sheets. If I can just stay still. her whispers start to recede. This would make for a sweet high angle shot. Me face down on a pillow in jeans and a sweaty t-shirt, all twisted up in wrinkled sheets. Why is this come down so fucking bad? Her whispers get closer. I'll leave us there, maybe.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so you know, for the people who are maybe new to this book, it is the story of a young woman who is well, it feels funny to even like try to do the elevator pitchy thing as someone who, I mean, it feels funny to try to do that with something that I did write, but it feels especially funny to do that with something that I didn't write. But it's a story of a young woman sort of traveling through Tehran on a day in which there are lots of earthquakes, and there's also some youth uprisings, you know, that that are sort of weirdly prescient, you know, as it would happen kind of historically, as this book was originally written in 2008. And she's an addict, so she's like sort of lurching from fix to fix, and so, you know, this is a book, as an Iranian who has written a lot about addiction and recovery and these sorts of things, this was obviously a book that immediately piqued my interest as soon as I heard about it. And then just in terms of the content, and then reading it, you know, the content was almost like the last thing that I remember, you know, or you know, I was so enamored of the voice and of these characters, which are like nothing that you ever read that makes its way stateside from Iran today, you know. And I know that you've spoken a little bit about this in that wonderful Granta piece, which I encourage everyone to read, which is just a brilliant piece about translation theory in general and thinking about why we translate. But can you talk a little bit about like how this reached you and how it called to you, and how you took on the project? And again, since you've spoken about this already, we don't have to spend too much time on it, but just to give some people who are new to the book a little bit of context.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so the book was wildly popular in Iran. So I actually picked it up just as, you know, going to a bookstore, picked up this book maybe a few years after it was published, and then held on to it for a while without reading it, as I think you know, a lot of us do, and then came to finally read it in Los Angeles, you know, maybe like 3-4 moves later, and I just really fell in love with the voice. And at the time, I was preparing for my comprehensive exams on modern Persian literature. And it also fascinated me, like the way that this book was in conversation with, but also really broke from the history of Iranian literature. It just wasn't really a voice I expected to see in print. And actually in translating the book, I would say probably popular blogs were my best resource, because like most of the language that is used here is not going to appear in a dictionary if there was like a phrase or word that was unfamiliar to me. But yeah, so that's kind of how I came to it. And I think it's just that even you could see in this little brief excerpt, there's such a no-nonsense attitude, but still this kind of softness to the voice. Like the main character, Shadi, is very observant, and you know, she goes between really like having a lot of compassion for the people around her and also just slapping them down. And so it was it's just bursting with so much that I found myself just kind of falling in love with it. And I was not trained as a translator. Translating this book really is what taught me how to translate. So it's not like I was looking for a project or, you know, wanting to take something like this on, but I just felt so captivated that I really wanted people to be able to read it in English. And I remember being shocked after reading it in Farsi and finding out that it hadn't been translated. time I was pretty surprised.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was shocked that it had had the sort of public life in Iran that it had, that it had had the series of, publications and even celebrations. It won the big sort of literary award, and then was sort of subsequently censored variously. And then, and you talk about how you sort of like retrofitted some of the slang in your translator's note at the back of the book, right? You talked about like how you added fucks where some fucks had been probably censored out of the Persian edition, or you know what I mean, like sort of like return. Can you talk a little bit about that process of sort of like returning the book to its full whole life? I mean, just as like a as my first book was translated into Farsi and published in Iran, and that process, my first book was largely about addiction, and they had to remove every reference to alcohol in a book about alcoholism. Like they had to replace the word alcohol, and so like, so the fact is that the version of the text that was like in circulation might not have been particularly exactly close in some really significant ways to what the author had intended, right? Or what the author was actually saying. So how did you find that calibration?
Yeah, well, so on the one hand, I would say that, many authors come up with these really ingenious ways to keep things as they want and get around the censor. So for example, just to, at the beginning, in one of these family scenes, the father is hosting a soiree and he's holding a sour glass. And it is actually, like, that is not added. That is the word in Farsi. It's called a sour glass. So it's very clear that he is drinking a cocktail, but it's indicated by, the glass, the object in his hand. It's not technically a reference to the alcohol. So like it could be filled with water or who knows. So, things like that. So I would say a lot of it, really is pretty, like what you see in the English is what you see in the Farsi. That said, there were, the process of censorship is really like a line by line edit in Iran. And so, there were words that were cut out of the original, and, so that sometimes the author kind of had to hold back and, let's say, like call somebody an asshole instead of something much more extreme. But so when I was translating, it became clear very early on that Shadi's voice just sounded really off in English, because somebody speaking this way in English would use a lot of like fuck or fucking, or, that word is just thrown around so much that it was pretty conspicuous to leave it out. And so I had a conversation with Mohebali about whether she wanted that sense of like something being held back in translation, or if, and she really was quite adamant that no, like that was not at all how she wanted the text to read. And I have to say, just as a translator, part of what you try to do is translate like the impact the book had on its own literary canon. And, this book is really prized in Iran for its naturalism and the sort of hyperrealism of the dialogue. And so it was important to put the word fuck in to get that across in English. Like, I actually think it would have been a mistranslation to leave it out. And it was, though, obviously very galvanizing to have the author's support in trying to get it just to kind of sound like natural speech in English.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, because there's a way in which, and I don't want to put too fine a point on this because this is not my field at all, but there's a way in which Persian cinema, especially Persian New Wave cinema, is so often praised for its radical humanism. That's the phrase that Jonathan Rosenbaum put out there that so often gets sort of bandied around or rejected by Iranian filmmakers. But when you think about like Kiarostami and the Kokar trilogy or whatever, like, and just like non-actors, playing roles in their hometowns who, and this sort of like radical, and it's almost like there's like a sense of that like hyper realism in your translation, right? Like there's a sense of this sort of aesthetic tradition, this 20th and 21st century aesthetic tradition that this is sort of continuing, right? Where do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, were you? I obviously, yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, I'm so glad you bring that up, Kaveh, because as a scholar, I would say that this book is as much in conversation with Iranian cinema as it is with books, and in a way, it's almost erroneous to put it that way. Really, what it is that Iranian literature is always in conversation with Iranian cinema. So there are pages in this book that really kind of read like a script in a sense. There's very little sense of what people are doing with their bodies, and it's just dialogue, often untagged, actually, just kind of this back and forth.
Stretches of pages that are untagged, you just kind of have to follow.
Yes, exactly.
I don't long pages that are untagged.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that it's about realism, and it's about this kind of grit that there is to reality, and I would say it really actually captures like the beauty of everyday life, but because it doesn't try to get rid of all the dirt.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's like I think you alluded to this in a previous, earlier in this conversation when you said something about like the fullness of the novel. But that's one of the great sort of takeaways, or one of the great sort of sensations that you get when you read this, is just this sort of the density and the super saturation of sensory experience, like in the tastes and smells, and not all of them pleasant, and there's like a kid, reading a ghazal while these other kids get high, and and the earth is shaking, and the people are chanting, there's this like profound sensory overload, which, again, is like also part of the literary technique. One of the things that I think that this book does really well is just is get to the sort of experience of the attic, sort of, there's this one hand where I want to read this book like a kind of like Baudelairean like flaneur, just sort of like strolling about, like looking at this, looking at that, looking in the windows, having these conversations, whatever. But it's also just like this addict, like lurching from crisis to crisis, right? Which is again something that I really recognize, right? And there's this one scene that I always think about where she's like, I copied it down here, but she says, fuck me, why did I think I could count on Rahim and Siamak, the dealers who hang out around Pilas Park, of more integrity than those two bastards? I mean, Rahim, that fucker, seriously, what kind of fool you think can count on it? And so like there's these like sort of like celestial cosmic earthquakes happening, and this like riot happening, and she's pissed off, about these two, she's pissed off about her two friends for fucking up this, and that's so, the sort of like granularity and the myopia of the attic, where like these sort of like literal earth shaking events are happening all around her, but she's just focused on this like totally granular and insignificant resentment in that moment. I thought was so well. I'm just sort of like clapping like a fawning seal instead of fawning seal is a mixed metaphor, but like I'm just sort of and seals bark too. They don't clap, or are they the ones that clap? It doesn't matter. But can you talk a little bit about just like rendering that super saturation, and then how it makes? I mean, okay, here's a question. Here's an actual question. Can you talk a little bit about how silence works in this text, and the way that the loudness of that supersaturation makes the quiet moments or the still moments of the still moments, whether they're getting high or having a more intimate exchange or whatever, how that foil sort of worked for you as a translator.
Yes, I mean, so you've used this word lurching a couple of times, and I just find it so appropriate. I mean, to me, the text really lurches between these moments of interiority and the almost like the violence of her social interactions. I mean, there, even with her friends, there's like a lot of antagonism there. And I think that the moment that you highlighted, which is very close to the end of the book, when she's really kind of taking stock of the day, the tragedy of that moment is that we start to see like those antagonisms really being turned inward, and she's picking herself apart for even being somebody who thought she could depend on anybody else. So yeah, I would say, I mean, as a translator, I think it was very difficult to almost develop two styles. So I tried to develop a style in the narrative voice that was honestly easier to do, because in American English literature, we are used to seeing that kind of a narrator with like some perspective and, you know, a command of language, and you know, it's just like a little bit more familiar. It seems literary in the way that we think about literature here. Yeah. But what was hard actually was then stepping aside and writing the dialogue in a way that really kind of goes back to what we were saying, was cinematic, you know, thinking about like what would people actually say, and how could I develop, then take that further to develop a distinct voice for each of the main characters, instead of kind of running them into each other. So that, you know, for example, like it was important to me that her brother Arash, like his slang would not sound like Shadi's slang.
Yeah.
Because on Farsi it was differentiated. You know, like they're in conversation with each other, but ultimately have loyalties to like different subcultures. So yeah, but I don't know, does that even really kind of?
Yeah, totally. No, that's, you know, and,
yeah.
I mean, like it's such an interesting thing to, and I don't think that people can really get a sense for this until they've tried it, to inhabit someone else's voice and try to render it with precision and accuracy, which are two different things, and to then also like not just inhabit the authorial voice, but inhabit the individual character voices that are each inflected by that authorial voice, you know, but like differentiated. It's such a Herculean enterprise that's like doomed to fail, and you still sort of gallop into it regardless. And I also have an older brother named Arash, and so I was particularly, although he's nothing like the Arash in the book, which thankfully, you know, but towards that end, I mean, one of the things, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this, the sort of like weird American or Western, I don't like the word Western because the earth is a sphere, and there's, you know, if you say Western, then you're saying west of what, and then it puts the center in Europe. But you know, the sort of like English speaking world's obsession with like Iranian stewardesses from 1978, like before the revolution, you know what I mean? Like look at how short their skirts were before everything went to hell for them, you know, as it, you know, and this sort of like weird cultural voyeurism, as if like, you know, that sort of regression is like this theme park or something that's like just happened in a vacuum or whatever, you know. And this novel is so, and you know, you and I and any sort of thinking human being knows that it's not so linear, or not, you know, it's not so, you know, that they didn't just like tear down the movie posters and paste pictures of the Ayatollah, and then everyone's sort of minds, immediately, leapt across that synapse along with the posters. But it's so interesting to me that, like, even as someone who knows all of that, and even as someone, who talks to people in Iran every day, that this book was still so shocking to me, and that I had still just never read anything like this book about Tehran.
Right. Well, it's not just Kaveh. I mean, when I have spoken to people in Iran, or very recent immigrants who had left Iran as adults, like, everybody is shocked that this was published in Iran. So it's actually not even about like a diasporic knowledge gap. I think in Iran, people continue to be surprised that this book is on the shelves in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a little miracle, and sometimes, like, when I'm teaching, when I'm teaching like undergrads in my poetry classes, like, and we talk about Plath or someone or someone of that era, or Brooks, or you have like the context of understanding that, like, the only woman that would have been taught in any poetry class that Plath had taken was like maybe Anne Bradstreet, or like maybe Dickinson, but like you could count them on one hand with fingers to spare. And then there was like Plath and Sexton writing about what they were writing about, or and contextualizing that element of risk, is really difficult to do, and that's one thing that I think that your book also or your translation rather really preserves, is like the sense that this is like legitimately like a sort of like countercultural experience, or this is a really kind of like subversive text that, like, it almost feels like the sort of book that I would like want to have as a teenager in my back pocket, like how Howl felt to me when I was like 16, you know what I mean? Like, just that sort of like key to understanding that the world is so much bigger than what I've been led to believe, and I think that you're opening that up for a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit about the sense of, I don't want to put too much weight on this idea, but like the sense of project or purpose or responsibility, whichever one of those words doesn't feel like sort of like immobilizingly solemn to you. Can you talk about that in relation to taking on this work?
Yes. It's immense, definitely there are translators working from Farsi, but it does remain relatively difficult to get, just kind of a literary press who's not an academic press to take on a work from contemporary Iran. And a lot of it is because of just the fear of the unknown. Like, this is not a place people have traveled. It's not France, it's not Argentina. It's not like, there's just really not a lot of transference between like here, the US, and contemporary Iran, like post-revolutionary Iran. And so obviously part of what I was interested in and translating this particular text was shaking up, people's ideas of like what they think it looks like, what they think it sounds like. In the translation, at a certain point, I actually made like a very conscious political decision to domesticate in the way that translators talk about. You either domesticate language or you like leave it as a kind of foreign, marked as a foreign text when you're translating. And I chose to go the domesticating route, so-called domesticating route, because I felt like that was actually more shocking, was for people to hear an English that sounds familiar, an American English, and to have to humanize the characters, because it sounded so familiar, and realize that they might just have like some of the same concerns.
Yeah.
I will say too that I think that the bigger picture issues that this book grapples with, the issues of gender and sexuality, issues of class, even the way that the counterculture and the drug use here actually operates as a kind of politics of protest against the status quo. All of that I see as completely relevant to the US context and the global context. I actually don't think that it is rooted in Iranian soil in that way. I think that a lot of the like bigger gender critiques that are here, a lot of the protests against class hierarchy and rules of respectability, and all of that actually is a conversation that we are having and need to continue having in the US. And so I see the critique as quite applicable. It's not about, like, translating this text was not for me about presenting some kind of snow globe, like behind glass version of Iran falling apart and everything being shaken up. The claim is that actually this text has something to say about our world, my stepping outside the door in Los Angeles, or where we are.
Yeah. I mean, like all sort of great writers, you and Mahsa have written from your unprecedented experience, and then that sort of like granular hyper focus becomes universal because of its granularity, right? Like that's kind of like, that's the thing that I have to disabuse new writers of all the time, is that if they just speak in sort of broad generalities, it'll apply to everyone. And in fact, it's quite the opposite, right? You get to the universal truth by talking about this this young woman addict who's cross-dressing as a man to move through the streets of Tehran. That's how you write about me and living my life with my cats in Indiana, you know what I mean? And that's how you get to that universal experience. I want to talk a little bit about, and I also want to invite those present in the audience to please share some questions. I'm going to leave the last like 15 or so minutes here so that you guys can ask questions of Mariam yourselves, so that you don't have to hear me sort of ambling around them. So please just share your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those. I appreciate you all being here. I wanted to ask a little bit about the translation itself, because and the glowing New York Times review that came out today, by the way, congratulations on that. And if you in the audience haven't read it, you should definitely go read it. Hagar Azmimi wrote a brilliant fawning essay about the book. It's the second time I've used fawning. And really insightful and wise, as everything she does is. But she talks a little, I think that she said, I was just looking at it before we talked here, and I think that she used the word courtly to describe written Farsi, which I thought was really interesting, and it is, I mean, even like the language itself, one of the examples that I talk about sometimes is like when you say like you're saying like I miss you, right? Like you're saying like but what it literally translates to is like my heart gets tight for you, or my heart grows tight for you, or whatever, and if you translate it as my heart grows tight for you, it sounds like really sort of like sentimental and saccharine, right? But if you translate it as I miss you, you lose all of the the texture of the thing, right? And so like neither one feels exactly true in English, right? But and in this book, I can't imagine how many sort of like parallel situations that you ran into where you're translating from one language that just like operates in a very different register. You know, there's so many phrases and concepts and ideas that don't have one-to-one correlatives, you know, and so can you talk about, I know in the translator's note you talked a little bit about the Tierensphere, Merensphere, you know, the which you ultimately translate as crisscrosser, which I thought was really interesting. Or am I remembering that right? Yeah. But can you talk about like some of these situations where you just had something that you were really struggling to bring into the English, if you can recall any in particular? You could talk about the crisscrosser too, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, that might be actually a pretty good example. I think kind of oppositely to what you were saying, Kaveh, about the portliness, which is true, definitely. This was an example pretty far afield of that, but that, you know, there's a moment in the book in which Shadi, who has been cross-dressing as a man, walking around Tehran in order to avoid and protest against the required hijab. You know, she has this flirtation with a man who, in a kind of inverse fashion, is quite feminized. So he has a long ponytail, he's very thin, you know, and so they kind of have this exchange, and he asks her what's up with the cap, you know, what's up with the hat, whatever. And he says that, oh, I would have taken you for one of these people, and he, you know, he says for a transfer mancer. So the it's a transfer, you know, it's a kind of transliteration of the word transfer from English, which of course we recognize is not so far from trans. And the transfer is just a way to kind of make something diminutive by like adding a nonsense rhyme onto it. So I had a really difficult time with this because the way, so on the one hand, like they have a pretty friendly rapport. On the other hand, there's obviously a certain amount of tension that's fueling the flirtation. And the way that he uses this is really not like sensitive. So it didn't make sense to translate the word as trans because that is just too respectful. And it's almost like giving this character too much credit. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it would have been a needless violence to use a slur, you know, like a kind of familiar English slur. I thought about it a ton, circled around it for over a year, I would say. And there were actually, I mean, this line and other lines in the book where they were just always on my mind, you know, like when I didn't even think that I was thinking about them, something would come to me, I would write it down. I'd like turn to a friend I was with and say, oh, like, how does this phrase sound to you? Does that sound off? Does it whatever? Literally would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with like a phrase occurring to me and like write it down and then have to see in the light of day whether it had solved the problem or, you know, I still hadn't found the key. And this one, I actually, you know, in the midst of that, I think this one was, it continued to be a problem very, very late. So my editor, Lauren Hook at Feminist Press, who was so amazing, really kind of got her hands dirty with me, nitty gritty. We continued to think about this through galley form. And then finally at some point kind of arrived at Crisscrosser, and I liked the way that it suggested this, like a transit or a transfer, but gone awry. And similarly to the like sounds that we see repeated in the Farsi diminutive transfer, we're getting like crisscross. It's almost the same, just changing the vowel sound in the middle, and it just seemed to work, I guess. But that actually is another one of the challenges, right? It's like getting something to work on a sound level in a similar way that it's working on a content level. It's a kind of formal content thing.
I mean, I think you would. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, just that like usually it's a losing battle. Like you often can't do both, and you'll have to migrate. Like a tactic is to then actually migrate some of the sound stuff onto a different part of the same sentence or somewhere in that vicinity. But in this case, it kind of worked out smoothly that there was actually like one word that was doing a lot.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think that you could get 1,000 translators in a room and give them each a year to work on this particular problem or this particular situation. I don't think any of them would come up with a more elegant solution than Crisscrosser. Just the way that it sort of like preserves the way that the original is like transfer is neither, it's neither sensitive nor malevolent, in Crisscrosser is sort of like right, and then like it preserves the kind of like playfulness of the sort of like just jibber jabber argle bargle of the original. It's really a pretty elegant solution. And I've never translated a whole novel, but I've dabbled in translation, and certainly I can say that it seldom have I landed upon such an elegant solution as you did there. So those solutions don't often present themselves, or at least they don't often present themselves to me. I want to be cognizant of the questions in the Q&A, and please keep posting those. But one last thing, I remember when a publisher, I won't mention them by name, but their name rhymes with Pandem Paus, was publishing one of my books abroad. There was this email, how like sometimes people will email you and add you in on a chain that you didn't start in on, and then you can like read all the stuff below, and this happened with me. And I was like reading, and they were like talking to each other about whether there would be like a Salman Rushdie situation regarding like the religious context of one of my books. You know what I mean? Like whether it was like teetering on like overly blasphemous in such a way that I would get like, but like I just remember like the Salman Rushdie situation in scare quotes. I wondered, did you ever battle Feminist Press is a great publisher. We all know that they do great work, but did you battle anything like that in the process of trying to find a publisher for this translation before you found Feminist Press? Did you battle people just like not understanding the project or being like, oh, we can't, what is this? This isn't about like, someone being incarcerated and like collecting daffodils and shidas or what, you know what I mean? Like, this isn't like sort of these pre-processed narratives that we have about Iran and the States. And so, how could we possibly hope to sell this, and will this get us in trouble, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it was very difficult to find a press for this. And there were a lot of things working against it. As a first-time translator, it's hard for people to trust you. So that just kind of complicated what was already a high barrier to entry. But the already is that it's just hard to get somebody to both feel comfortable enough to take something on from contemporary Iran and feel interested enough or like confident that it'll sell, or there's just so much, I think, both culturally and from the business perspective, that makes it really hard. And Feminist Press was amazing. It was like dating, where it's just been years of misses, and then you are just like, oh my God, this is actually working. You know, like they were really excited about it. There weren't any qualms about taking it on, and just like worked out really smoothly when it finally got in their hands. But you know, before that, there was a lot of interest, but then like people wouldn't pull the trigger, you know, so it was fun. And then some of the responses were, it's not edgy enough. That was like one response I thought was kind of funny. Or there was like somebody who said, is there's so much dialogue in the whole book. Like I had sent like a 2-chapter sample, and they're like, does the rest of the book have so much dialogue? It's annoying, you know, like it was just, there was a kind of, I think like an expectation. Sometimes we have this expectation that translated literature is going to sound like what we think by our standards literature should be. It just like happens to be written in a different language. But that's not always the case, right? I mean, like part of what can be interesting about translated literature is that it really forces us to think about what literature can be instead of what it should be, even in the language we're writing in. Yeah. So yeah, I think it was that process, and finally then it did work out. And but you know, I couldn't have thought of like a more fit-in publisher for this.
Yeah. So. Well, and I love what you say about the idea, the expectation that translated literature is just going to be like Stephen King or Sue Grafton in another language, just waiting to be like brought into English. You know what I mean? Like the author couldn't help but having to write it in the language that they wrote it, you know, but and you know, I think that one of the things that travel disabuses you of is that everyone else in the world sort of sits on this throne of like post irony or whatever the fuck, like American aesthetic audiences like sort of just expect everything to be like kind of like sneering at contemptfully at sincerity and genuine, you know, and that's a very, very sort of like Anglo tradition, you know, relatively new, you know, and that doesn't, you know, I think that posture of aesthetic irony presupposes that you are in a position of privilege and able to laugh at yourself, right, in a certain way, you know, that you have been used to being, that you have to be the one laughing at yourself because you are sort of, there's the expectation that no one else is laughing at you. And I think that the sort of lack of that bedrock irony in a lot of translated literature catches people off guard, and people don't quite know how to take that, which is neither here nor there, and that's another conversation that hopefully we can have over coffee someday. But I want to turn to the Q&A, and we've got some really, really great questions here. Kelsey would like to know, can you talk a little bit about the queerness, both overt and tacit, in the novel?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the queerness, I would say, there's a lot of queerness. Some of it looks like what we think of as queerness in the US, and some of it doesn't. So let's say the cross-dressing is for Shadi, and in this context, not in this context, just for her specifically, like in the context of the book, it's not identitarian. So obviously there is a trans community in Tehran. Shadi herself, though, is cross-dressing just in order to evade hijab law. And this is actually a thing. It's called Mard Pushi, which just means like man wearingness. And it's women who cross-dress as a political act against mandatory hijab. On the other hand, we see her, I've already mentioned this flirtation with Ponytail, who himself has this kind of, you know, femininity to him and like gender bendingness. And then she also flirts with a lot of female characters, and specifically someone who's described as her childhood best friend. So sexually, I think that there's a kind of free sexuality here that, you know, attaches to a lot of objects and lovers, regardless of gender. And I see that as pretty clear. I don't know, Kaveh, if you had anything to add. But...
Yeah, well, I mean, again, like, I think that, yeah, I mean, you touched on it beautifully. I also just think that, like, you know, as a poet, I'm constantly thinking about like the queering of syntax and the queering of language, which are everywhere, which is everywhere apparent in this book and in this translation. You know, the queering of family, the queering of friendship, you know, the queering of the tectonics of personhood. You know, I mean, it's everywhere apparent in this text, and you know, someone smarter than me, I'm sure, could make a fine sort of graduate thesis out of it. But yeah, I think that's one of the really sort of stirring components of this book, not just like overt behavioral sort of romantic queerness, but just like queerness at every structural level of the text. We have another question from Elisa, and this was actually one of the questions that I had that I didn't get to. Can you talk about the process of deciding how to translate the title and why you chose "In Case of Emergency"? So the original Farsi title is something closer to like "Don't Worry," right? And the English title is more like "In Case of Emergency." Oh no, did I freeze? Am I frozen? Can you hear me? Oh no. Shit. Oh, can you hear me?
I couldn't hear you. I don't know if...
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, my screen froze. So the question from Elisa or Alyssa is, can you talk about the process of deciding how to translate the title and why you chose "In Case of Emergency"? And so the original Farsi title is something more like "Don't Worry," right? And the English title is "In Case of Emergency." So if you wanted to talk about that.
Exactly. So yeah, the Farsi title is Negaran Nabash, which is "Don't Worry," or really kind of "Don't Worry About It." And that was one of the big problems, is that the literal translation of the phrase "don't worry" in English really wouldn't stand alone. You know, like you'd see like "don't worry, comma, you'll be fine. Don't worry, whatever." And to translate it, you'd have to like add all these kind of filler words that you really don't want in a title. So "don't worry about it," "no worries," you know, something like that. But the bigger issue was that a literal translation often does not translate tone. And so it's actually a mistranslation. And so, you know, in the Farsi, it's important that there's something kind of sinister to the phrase being used in this context. And, you know, the title was very difficult to translate. This was a years-long problem of like lists of possible things, and, you know, and then in the end, "In Case of Emergency" seemed to capture the combination of a really flat tone, but applied to something that is actually quite bad. And it had the kind of like bureaucratic tone of, you know, that I think is important. Like we thought about other, like, you know, "chill out, relax," like things like that were just, I mean, one, cheesy, but also just not really getting at the way that, you know, that's used against her in the book by people of authority. So whether it's like police or her mother, or, you know, like people just like demanding a relaxed attitude as a way to actually paper over what is totally a mess. Like that's supposed to be the sense of it.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that was one of the questions that I had written down before I just got carried away and excited and just started freestyling. And that's a really difficult thing to do. I love what you said. I mean, like I could listen to you talk and write about translation all day because I think it's so interesting. But like the idea that like a literal translation, the trot can sometimes be a mistranslation, because the tone isn't preserved. And so like the literal, pure denotative definition is not what it actually means, or is not what it means in any valence save just the purely denotative, which is only one, valence of many of meaning. Okay, so Heather asks, and this is the last question that we have here, and I don't want to keep you past the appointed time, but Heather asks, what word, phrase, or section was most difficult or complex to translate and why, and what was your process in coming to a satisfying translation? So this is something that we've kind of touched on a few places, but maybe something that we haven't touched on, or an example that we haven't touched on.
I'll talk about a different part of the book that actually brings up other distinct issues to the transformance, for example. So the beginning of the book, from which I read, was very difficult to translate because spatially, I realized at some point that American readers had no idea what was going on because Shadi's voice is very laconic and doesn't give a lot of attention to like where things are in the room or where bodies are, or and there's a way of kind of theorizing that is quite purposeful. Like there's a disembodiedness to this text in a certain sense that contrasts with the most embodied and visceral moments are about like drugs coursing through the body and or a lack, So anyway, the beginning was very difficult to translate because the setup of this home, this kind of like grand 2-story old Tehran home, was just so confusing, I realized, to people that they didn't know how to picture it. And even the move of, starting with a character who's not named, only mentioning the fact that she is her mother, like very late in the game. There just was a lot going on that was disorienting. And I had to really decide what was purposefully disorienting and what actually an Iranian reader could take for granted and was only disorienting to the American reader. So there's no need to preserve that. So let's say like with the she, that's as disorienting and Farsi, like you don't know who she's talking about. So I kept that because the point is that she has this kind of, like distance attitude towards her mother. But then with the house, in that first chapter, I actually like added very, very small tweaks of just being like, designating, there are 2 living rooms, one on each floor. So I like designated one a living room and one a parlor. I'd add words like going upstairs or downstairs, like just things like that to give people just a touch more of what this looks like. But, I think, I don't know, it was difficult, I think, to recreate that tone, like the kind of in medias res, you're being thrown in the deep end.
Yeah.
And how do you do that in a way that does throw the reader in the deep end but doesn't drown them? Like I think that was the difficulty.
Yeah, and trust the reader's faculties to be able to make connections, and that I mean that's something that I have struggled with too, of like how much am I allowed to sort of like explain for the author or like account for this like gulf of context between contexts, you know what I mean? And how much am I allowed to like change to, you know, I mean, this is the sort of like eternal horizontal question that you just march towards forever and you never actually arrive at. Okay. One, I know I said that last question was going to be, oh shit, there are so many. Okay. The questions are pouring in now. But I want to, if it's okay with you, maybe honor one bonus one. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
And then and then I promise I'll shut up after this. And everyone, you know, if you are an attendee with who needs to like go relieve the babysitter or something, please buy this book, buy 8 copies. It makes a great stocking stuffer. But one of my students, one of my grad students, Monir Zadeh, who is currently in Iran for another few weeks, says this book received a Hossein Golshiri Prize, a prestigious prize in Iran, but is currently banned. So I think right now at the second it is banned, maybe. And we've talked about how it keeps going on and off the ban list, right? She wanted to know, like, what are the she said, what are the reasons for its being banned in your idea? Like, why would it be banned right now? Do you think it has to do with the American publication? Do you think that, have you gotten any sort of sense of that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't. Actually, this is news to me because last I checked, which was 2 weeks ago, it was still being sold.
Oh, really?
So if it is indeed banned, it's very recent, and yeah, I'm just not sure that I would be able to speculate as to the kind of like machinations of the Ministry of Guidance.
Sure. Well, I mean, we've certainly orbited some of the reasons for which it might be, you know, frowned upon under the current regime. Thank you so much for talking to me. We didn't get a chance to get to all the questions, but I hope so much. I hope so much that you know, we're all babies in this universe and we'll all live forever. And in the fullness of time, we'll all have ample opportunity to ask each other everything. But this is such a brilliant book. It's called In Case of Emergency by, I'm sure that Brookline will post the link to buy 20,000 copies from them so that you can all do that. Truly makes a great stocking stuffer. I've given away several copies to students already. I'm sure I will still continue to give away copies through the quarantine. A really, really incredible book, a really, really incredible act of service to the English language, which you talk about, Mariam, by enriching the English language with these characters and these idioms and these rhythms, and just a really, really, really wonderful thing. And I'm so lucky to have it in my life. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Kaveh.
Thank you so much, both of you. Yes, we do have copies, came out today in store and online. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. This was just, yes, just brilliant. I was just about to say that, Jenny. Thank you both. Okay.